Hello there, my name is Daniel Backer, and this is my son Pringle. My other son Lawrence thought that he was in charge of Write Better Stories, and he was trying to talk over me. So this is like my third attempt at making this video. He has been temporarily relocated downstairs, and he will be brutally punished later. So I wanted to make this because I saw the movie Us last night. And again, I attempted to make a video last night, but Lawrence was talking a lot, and Pringle started chiming in as well. And so I said I would do it this morning. Same thing this morning. We're going to try it again this time. Us is a really cool movie, and I think it's definitely one that you should see in theaters. I'd also like to get out of the way that I'm going to be spoiling the entire thing, so please make sure that you watch it before watching this video, or if for whatever reason you don't want to watch it and just want to hear it from me. I don't know why you would want to do that. I guess keep watching. But, again, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. Do not enter. Do not go further. Us was really cool, and it uses a lot of the concepts that I've talked about in these videos with good characters, good anticipation of action, and just a good arc to the entire thing. And this is a movie that's a really great example of having a very abstract, larger-than-life theme, but presenting it in a very scenic, grounded way. I'm going to be getting into my interpretation of it, but obviously everything that I'm going to say is just my interpretation. And the person that I saw it with and another friend of mine who saw it a little bit later than us, we all had wildly different interpretations as to what this movie means. So I think that's one of the most successful things about it, is that it obviously is trying to say something, but it ends up being so abstract. Any one thing that the movie Us is supposed to be about can't really be easily stated, and it's going to be very open to interpretation. So a lot of movies go for a psychological theme, and it can end up being very vague and artsy. Other ones don't really try to go for any kind of psychological theme at all, and the scenes are just about exactly what they're about. Us is a movie that sort of bridges the gap between those two things. It sort of reaches behind the content of the scenes into your subconscious and starts playing there with a lot of just really loaded imagery. And again, it's very difficult to say in particular what it's trying to say, but I'm going to do my best in talking about this and then see if we can pull any specific elements from this that you could add to your stories in order to write better stories. There Pringle is. Make sure he's in the frame. So first things first, one of the best things that you can take from this movie is just its use of details. Everything really gets tied back in, especially in the first act, and I think this is common for a lot of horror films. In the first act, a lot of stuff, you're kind of just like waiting for the movie to get started. Now, that would be in a bad horror film if you're just waiting. In this case, I think it's a good example of the anticipation of action, because you can just tell that they're setting a lot of stuff up. It's about Adelaide and her family going to this beach house that she used to go to when she was a kid, and we get a little bit of insight into her past, that she, while at the Santa Cruz Pier, wandered into this hall of mirrors and then had an experience with this double. Now when she brings, or this doppelganger, I'll refer to it as a doppelganger or a double interchangeably throughout the video. But we understand that she sort of withdrew within herself after having this traumatic experience when she was young. And I think that this is a really good use of like blending the past and the present in a film without the use of flashbacks. A lot of people will give the advice that you shouldn't use a flashback, and I don't think that this technically qualifies as a flashback, but just to sort of expand on that advice, I think the reason you're not supposed to give flashbacks, or that people say don't use flashbacks, is because they can often inject exposition that the audience should just be able to take from the presently unfolding movie that's right in front of you. So that would be probably your test to see if your flashback or if your cut to the past is worth it or not. Is the point of the flashback just to demonstrate something that you could probably just put in the story without having to cut to a flashback? Are you just trying to put in exposition? In this case, you probably don't have to use it. An example of this, like, weakly done flashback is in the movie Baby Driver. Overall, I liked Baby Driver a lot, but halfway through, they give you this flashback of his parents like dying in a car wreck, and that's like why he drives, because his parents died in a car wreck, and it just didn't need it, you know? And like, you saw what they were trying to do to give him this backstory, but This was done pretty weakly. Us, on the other hand, is an example that cuts between the past and the present very effectively, and then the sort of reveal at the end of the movie ends up really demanding that investigation of the past, because you get a little bit more insight on what happened in her traumatic event when walking into that hall of mirrors that made her withdraw within herself. But we'll get to that toward the end of the video. But like I was saying, in that first act, it's a lot of just planting details. Little things that seem very innocuous when they first get brought up end up becoming a lot more significant, or at least they end up being used later in the movie. And this is really smart. It's just good storytelling. Like, we learn that Adelaide's daughter wants to drive, but she's not of age yet. Not very important when they first bring it up. In fact, it just seems like he's trying to give her a little character. It's like she's 15 or younger and she wants to drive. I think she's maybe 14 in the movie. I forget. But yeah, you don't really think anything of it. You're just like, oh yeah, she's a young girl who wants to drive. She mentions that one of her friends was allowed to drive, even though she wasn't of age yet, and her parents are like, no. But then later in the movie, her dad has like a hurt leg, and her mom, Adelaide, is like handcuffed, so she has to drive. I don't know if this is like necessarily rife for interpretation, but it's just a good example of them planting this little detail that you didn't think was important and then making it a bigger deal as it goes on. Another good example of this is the dad. He buys a boat for the family, and he surprises everybody, and one of the things about the boat is that the motor dies and he's got to like hit it, and then he mentions that it veers to the left. When they first bring up these details, you're just like, oh yeah, it's just like supposed to be like, oh, his dad bought a shitty boat. But they end up using this a lot more, specifically in a scene when the dad's doppelganger and he are on the boat. Halfway through, when he's all like wrapped up in a trash bag, the doppelganger has to go and try to restart the engine again, and then this gives him time, the dad that is, to stand up and hit the doppelganger into the water. But then the boat starts up unexpectedly and he falls in the water. I'm pretty sure that's how it was. And so then we get them both in the water for this really cool scene where they have to like figure that out. And I think the boat, since it's been continuing going along, it's got a rope attached to it that's also attached to the doppelganger, so it like takes the doppelganger away in the water. But since he mentioned that it veers to the left, the boat ends up like going away and then eventually circling back to him. So again, I don't know if it's like necessarily a big meaningful thing that you have to like interpret or pick apart, or like what psychological thing are they going for, but it's more of just like it's a detail in that first act that was used very economically later. So that's a concept I bring up in stories, or in analysis of stories a lot, is the economy of the story. That details that you put in your story, they can end up being wrapped back in to have more significance later, or just to be used later at all. So this is a pretty good example. Don't just give your characters a detail. Give them a detail that's going to maybe play into the story at some point. This is, I think, one of the most successful parts of Us, is that almost every detail in that first act that's given ends up paying off in some way, whether they just use the information or they investigate it a little bit further in the movie. So pretty cool in that regard. Now, this is also a great film for just when like the lock-in happens, when you're like, okay, it's on, because it's almost, it all happens within just a few seconds where they're like, okay, we're in the movie now. All of this setup and everything in first one is behind us. It's time for Act 2. We're going to explore this premise that we have been promised. And this all happens really, really quick. It's shortly after Adelaide tells her husband about her traumatic experience in the mirror room, and he's like, oh, baby, it was just like a mirror. And she's like, no, it was a double. What happens during this is that the power goes out. And then immediately after that, you get this jump scare of the son who appears in the door. And then immediately after that, he's like, oh, there's a family outside, and they go check it out, and sure enough, all their doppelgangers are there on the driveway. This is just like boom, 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 boom. It's really effective in the movie because it just gets you right into it. I don't know if he was intentionally trying to subvert a lot of the more easing into it that you get in other horror films, but I think you would expect in other horror films maybe to have a little bit more anticipation of what these monsters are. And this, it's like once they're there, they're there. They're up, they're all holding hands on the front of the driveway, and they've got to deal with it. So I think that since I'm about halfway in, I'm going to go ahead and just start talking about my interpretation of the entire movie, because There's a lot of great details in it that you can pick apart. I guess maybe before I get into the interpretation, I'll mention after the doppelganger family shows up and they actually get into the room. This is just one of the most powerful scenes. We get them all like perfectly mirrored across from each other. Of like the dad's doppelgangers across from the dad, the sons with the son, the daughter with the daughter, Adelaide with Adelaide. You get the idea, right? And this is, I think, a sort of visual motif that's consistent across the entire movie. This idea of mirroring and doubling, 11:11 plays into it pretty significantly with like a guy who's like proselytizing with a piece of cardboard that says like Jeremiah 11:11, and then his double ends up having like 11:11. If it is not totally obvious, 11:11 is obviously like a mirror image of itself. There's another moment where there's a frisbee that's thrown and it lands perfectly on a little circular dot on their towel. All of this is him as a director, Jordan Peele, playing with this idea of doubling. He's really letting the mise en scène, or the actual environment, everything that you see on camera, mirror this theme that he's playing for of doubling and doppelgangers. So this is something that you can play within your story as well, to let the environment demonstrate the tension or the thematic investigation of the story. And it's really effective in the film. Any one of those, I think, may or may not have an interpretation, but it's more just about how the fact that you, as a viewer, are along with Adelaide as she is seeing all these doubles. Because this is what she brings up to her husband before the doppelganger family shows up. It's like, I think my double is watching me. I think my doppelganger is coming for me because I keep seeing all these little coincidences. There you go. That's all that it's got to be. We don't know if the frisbee matching up with the dot necessarily means that or not, but it's the fact that Adelaide thinks that it means something. That's all that we're supposed to take from that, in my opinion. Now, after I was talking about that scene where the doppelgangers are in the room, perfectly mirrored across from the family. It's a great visual element there, and we get this really kick-ass monologue from Adelaide's doppelganger of her just talking about, in that deep, throaty, scary voice, about how she's been planning all this stuff, and she's back for, I don't even remember what. She's basically like, we're going to fuck you guys up. And I just read in an article before making this video that he was inspired by the movie Funny Games, and I never would have guessed that by watching it, but that's basically about these kind of, Clockwork Orange type crazy guys that come in and terrorize this family inside their house. It makes total sense. Funny Games is also a crazy postmodern film where at one point one of the characters literally picks up a remote control and rewinds part of the film that he is in, and they redo a scene. So if you like that sort of thing, there's a lot of fourth wall breaks and sort of playing with audience's expectations very explicitly. So watch Funny Games if you're into that more like aware, postmodern, not your daddy's horror film. But what's cool is after each of the doubles terrorizes their own double, like the dad's drags the dad outside with a baseball bat. The son and the son go and play. The daughter, who they mention, there's another detail that they mention that you don't think is important and they bring back, that she could be an Olympic runner one day, but she's like, I don't want to be a runner. So then the shadow mom tells the daughter and the doppelganger daughter, like, go run, you know? And I'm not explaining it very well, but it's another good detail that was wrapped up in there. But then we've got Adelaide and her double alone in the room, and I think her double like handcuffs her to the table, and she presses her face against the coffee table, and you get a really cool image of her face being pressed up against an image of itself. And this is another great example of the environment taking on the thematic tension of the film. It is not an accident that we're seeing her face pressed up against a mirror reflection of her face. That is, in so many ways, technically what the movie is about, is these doubles confronting each other, and it's the point where her double is pushing her face into it, so it's like cracking. And apart from being a very visceral image, it's a very potent image as well. And I think that this is sort of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about how character actions can end up demonstrating the psychological tension of either the characters or the film at large. It doesn't always have to be a specific action that talks about somebody's specific psychological state. It could be just making a larger point on the movie itself. But again, it's not wordy, it's not heady. It's not like she's saying, oh, and now the doubles confront each other and they're getting too close for comfort. He's literally showing us this with the double pushing Adelaide's face into the coffee table and having it crack a little bit like that. So really cool image. Okay, so I talked for that about 5 minutes. Now I'm going to talk about the interpretation of the film. I'm going to try to keep it at about 20 minutes total, because some of the other videos have run long. But to me, this just screams Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. The opening of the film has this text on the screen that basically says all throughout the United States there are unused tunnels. There's like old service ways or service roads that aren't used, subway tunnels, things like that. And oh, the last line of it is like, many of them are unused and neglected, or something like that. And to me, I interpret that as his kind of thesis for the movie, being like, the things that we neglect and repress within ourselves will ultimately come back to terrorize us. And again, this is almost textbook projection of the shadow and shadow work a la Carl Jung. So if you're not completely familiar with that, I talk about it a little bit more in a video about his book, The Undiscovered Self. But the idea of projection has pretty much made its way into colloquial speech. So it's not nearly as abstract as you might think that it is if you haven't heard that it is from Carl Jung. It's basically what I said. It's all of those things that you don't like about yourself. You repress them and come up with this version of yourself that's likable or seems to be likable or acceptable for society, but all those things that you repress are still part of you, so they come out in all kinds of unpleasant ways. And then a step further, which I don't think he really explores in the film Us, maybe, I don't know, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, is the idea of projecting it, is that since you can't accept it in yourself, it's more obvious to see it in other people, and you end up hating that person, but the only reason that you hate it is because you've repressed it in yourself. There you go. It kind of has to do with that platitude of like, oh, we only hate in others what we hate most in ourselves. I'm not prepared to completely say that this is 100% true all the time. For example, like if somebody does something truly atrocious, that doesn't necessarily mean that you also want to do something truly atrocious, but maybe it does. I'm just saying that that's not really the point of my video today, to talk about whether or not that's 100% true all the time, because then it just gets into all kinds of weird moral things you have to confront yourself about. It's like, is there a murderer in you because you don't like murderers? I don't know, maybe there is. But again, this is what this film seems to be about pretty obviously, in my opinion, is that these repressed aspects of ourselves end up coming back. And it's sort of an abstract thing to say, but to see it demonstrated in a film, in images, is very effective. Every character in the movie, and all throughout the United States actually, ends up getting a doppelganger that ends up terrorizing them specifically. And so it's all about them just having to confront that. And the doppelgangers want to kill you, basically. And I think that this is relevant to the image that he has at the beginning of the film that becomes more significant later, of rabbits being in boxes, these like white rabbits. Some of them are not white, which I noticed, but for the most part it's white rabbits. And I think that this is a pretty obvious reference to the idea of following the white rabbit. It's like the idea of a rabbit hole, that at first they're all in cages, and so it's like we don't investigate it. Anything in our subconscious that we would find by following the white rabbit will not be found because we have caged our rabbits, but then by the end, all the rabbits are out running everywhere as Adelaide is fighting her double in this sort of underground area behind the scenes in the mirror house. And yeah, to me, I think it's as simple as that. It could be more complicated. I know the rabbits are being eaten raw at one point, but I think that just basically means is that deep in our subconscious underground, the things that we don't address in those unused tunnels, is that more disgusting, murderous part of us. So then ultimately what ends up happening is she goes down and she fights her double, and she kills her double after a pretty harrowing fight by, like, I think breaking her neck with the chain of her handcuffs. And a kind of creepy thing happens. After she does this, she sort of takes on that voice. Like, after she does this, she does have like kind of a grunting, guttural voice that up until this point had only been associated with her shadow. And then this is when they make the reveal of the movie, is that the traumatic thing that happened to her at the beginning of the film was that her double in the Hall of Mirrors dragged her into the underworld and switched places with her. So the entire time, this woman that you thought was the original her and that the double was underground, they were switched. It was that she was the dark version of herself the entire time. And to me, what this image means is that it's basically just a way of tying your double to you, or your shadow to you, that it's not really any different from yourself. There aren't really two you. They're one and the same. Anything that you would take to be disgusting and nasty about yourself is not different from you. It's a part of you this entire time. And so we look at her double this entire time, or who we think is her doppelganger the entire time, as the evil one while she's the good one, but it turned out they were both evil, and they're both good, kind of. They both have their own reasons for doing things. And so to me, that is just what the movie screams at me. Other people have had wildly different interpretations than this, so I'd be interested to hear what everybody else thinks, if I'm completely off the mark, or if you just thought of something completely different. One of my friends told me that he thought it was about poverty and about like the way that America treats the poor. I didn't get that from this movie at all, but I think it's a very compelling interpretation, and he came up with a bunch of examples for why that might be the case as well. Also, in the last shot of the movie, or one of the last shots, the son had watched his mom strangle her doppelganger, and he's pretty horrified by this. And one of the last shots is him looking at his mom without any trust. And this is also another very potent shot that I think has a bunch of different interpretations that you can take from it. Throughout the movie, she's especially protective of her son, and I think that this is, him recognizing, wait a minute, my mom's evil. Maybe he recognizes she was the doppelganger. Or this is just like this young boy who's pretty innocent, and him realizing that the world is more complicated than he could have expected. Not everything is completely morally black and white. It's very complex. And she just kind of gives him this knowing smile. And I think you could look at this as her being like, haha, I am the evil one after all. But I don't know if he really gives you that. The smile she gives is more of her, it's this motherly recognition toward her son that he doesn't trust her, and she's just like, yeah, the world is complicated. It isn't so easy to figure out. And then we get this awesome pull-out of all of the hand-in-hand people across America in their red jumpsuits, which is to say that I think all of us have this shadow that we're dealing with. All of us have this part of ourselves that we repress. What I talked about today is but a fraction of what you can take from this movie. Like I said, writing-wise, it's a really good example of a film that uses its genre elements to transcend the genre. I don't know if I mentioned in this one that Tim Heidecker is in it, and I love Tim Heidecker. It's really cool to see him in a horror film and get to play just a role that you don't always see. The direction is amazing. All of the things that he is putting into the shots is just so cool. I don't know as much about the film aspect, and so I try to focus mostly on story. But again, see this film. I'm sure you already have if you were willing to watch me talk about it, but go watch us. It's really cool. And I'm going to watch Get Out now and catch up with what the rest of the world has already seen. All right, goodbye.